A war game is a strategy game that deals with military operations of various types, real or fictional. Wargaming is the hobby dedicated to the play of such games, which can also be called conflict simulations, or consims for short. When used professionally by the military to study warfare, wargame may refer to a simple theoretical study or a full-scale military exercise. Hobby wargamers have traditionally used wargame, while the military has generally used wargame. This is not a hard and fast rule, although there may be disagreements as to whether a particular game qualifies as a wargame or not. A general consensus exists that all such games must explore and represent some feature or aspect of human behavior directly bearing on the conduct of war, even if the game subject itself does not concern organized violent conflict or warfare. The business war games exists too, but in general they are only role-playing games based on market situations. War games are generally categorized as historical, hypothetical, fantasy, or science fiction. Historical games by far form the largest group. These games are based upon real events and attempt to represent a reasonable approximation of the actual forces, terrain, and other material factors faced by the actual participants. Hypothetical games are games grounded in historical fact but concern battles or conflicts that did not actually happen. Fantasy and science fiction war games either draw their inspiration from works of fiction or provide their own imaginary setting. Highly stylized conflict games such as chess are not generally considered war games, although they are recognized as being related. Games involving conflict in other arenas than the battlefield, such as business, sports or natural environment, are similarly usually excluded. The modern wargaming hobby has its origins at the beginning of the 19th century, with von Riewitz's Kriegspiel rules. Later, H.G. Wells' book Little Wars ushered in the age of miniatures games in which two or more players simulated a battle as a pastime. During the 1950s, the first large-scale, mass-produced board games depicting military conflicts were published. These games were at the height of their popularity during the 1970s, and became quite complex and technical in that time. Wargaming has changed dramatically over the years, from its roots in miniatures and board wargaming to contemporary computer and computer-assisted wargames. However, both miniature and board wargames maintain a healthy, if small, hobby market, with lighter games being popular with many non-wargamers. Overview. Like all games, wargames exist in a range of different complexities. Some are fundamentally simple, often called beer and pretzel games, whereas others attempt to simulate a high level of historical realism. These latter games typically require extensive rulebooks that encompass a large variety of actions and details. These games often require a considerable study of the rules before they can be played. Wargames also feature a range of scales, from games that simulate individual soldiers to ones that chart the course of an entire global or even galactic war. Wargames are generally a representational art form. Usually, this is of a fairly concrete historical subject, but it can also be extended to non-historical ones as well. The Cold War provided fuel for many games that attempted to show what a non-nuclear World War III would be like, moving from a recreation to a predictive model in the process. Fantasy and science fiction subjects are sometimes not considered war games because there is nothing in the real world to model. However, conflict in a self-consistent fictional world lends itself to exactly the same types of games and game designs as does military history. Because of these attitudes, there are many games and types of games that may appear to be a war game at first glance, but are not accepted as such by members of the hobby, and many that would be considered debatable. Risk could be considered a war game. It uses an area map of the Earth and is unabashedly about sending out armies to conquer the world. However, it has no readily discernible time frame, and combat is extremely abstract, leading many to not consider it as an actual war game, or only tangentially as one. The highest percentage of war-themed games that are not war games come from the video game industry. Most markedly real-time strategy games deal with combat nearly exclusively, but the gameplay-enhancing conventions of the genre also destroy realism. For example, in actual combat, vehicle armor is generally a binary proposition. Either the round penetrates and the vehicle is knocked out, or it does not and the vehicle is unaffected. RTS games make a habit of giving a vehicle a health bar that generally allows it to survive even powerful single shots, but each hit reduces its health by some amount, allowing a high volume of rifle fire to knock out a well-armored tank. Other notable genre conventions include the construction of buildings and vehicles within the time frame of a battle and a lack of any command and control, supply, or morale systems. A major determinant of the complexity and size of a wargame is how realistic it is intended to be. Some games constitute a serious study of the subject at hand, whereas others are intended to be light entertainment. In general, a more serious study will have longer, more detailed rules, more complexity, and more record-keeping. More casual games may only bear a passing resemblance to the subject, although many still try to encourage the same types of decision-making as the player's historical counterparts, and thereby bring forth the feel of the conflict. Wargames tend to have a few fundamental problems. Notably, both player knowledge and player action are much less limited than what would be available to the player's real-life counterparts. Some games have rules for command and control and fog of war, using various methods. While results vary, many of these mechanisms can be cumbersome and onerous in traditional games. The edge of world problem raises the issue of what to do at the artificial boundary of the physical edge of a board game. In contrast to real life where there is no edge, and units off-board can have a tangible effect on a scenario, computer wargames can more easily incorporate these features because the computer can conceal information from players and act as an impartial judge. However, due to interface issues, these can still be found to be as frustrating to the player as traditional methods. History. According to Max Boot's book War Made New, sometime between 1803 and 1809, the Prussian General Staff developed wargames, with staff officers moving metal pieces around on a game table, using dice rolls to indicate random chance and with a referee scoring the results. Increasingly realistic variations became part of military training in the 19th century in many nations, and were called Kriegsspiel, or war games. War games or military exercises remain an important part of military training today. Modern wargaming originated with the military need to study warfare and to reenact old battles for instructional purposes. The stunning Prussian victory over the Second French Empire in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 is sometimes partly credited to the training of Prussian officers with the game Kriegsspiel, which was invented around 1811 and gained popularity with many officers in the Prussian army. These first war games were played with dice which represented friction, or the intrusion of less than ideal circumstances during a real war, though this was usually replaced by an umpire who used his own combat experience to determine the results. Civilians start playing. The first specific non-military wargame club was started in Oxford, England. In the 19th century, naval enthusiast and analyst Fred T. Jane came up with a set of rules for depicting naval actions with the use of model ships, or miniatures, around 1898. The 1905 6th edition of Jane's Fighting Ships includes a revised edition for the Naval War Game. H.G. Wells' books Floor Games and Little Wars were attempts to codify rules for fighting battles with toy soldiers, and make them available to the general public. They were very simple games, and in some ways just provide a context for shooting spring-loaded toy cannons at toy soldiers. But, in his appendix to Little Wars, Wells speaks of the changes required to convert his admittedly simplistic rules into a more rigorous Kriegspiel. However, Wells also states in his rules that combat should be by actual gun and rifle fire and not by computation. Things should happen and not be decided, in opposition to the general nature of Kriegspiel play. In 1940, Fletcher Pratt's naval war game was first published. The game started in New York, but other clubs formed around the USA. Jack Hoggins was invited by Pratt to participate, and recalled that Pratt's game involved dozens of tiny wooden ships built to a scale of about 1 inch to 50 feet, spread over the living room floor of his apartment. Their maneuvers and the results of their battles were calculated via a complex mathematical formula, with scale distances marked off with tape measures. The game's popularity grew, and moved to using a ballroom for games with 60 or more players per side. The game was respected by the Naval War College, and serving naval officers regularly participated in games for an evaluation of the Fletcher Pratt game versus reality. See Chapter 10 of the Fletcher Pratt Naval War Game book. Link. All of these games were meant to be accessible to the general public, but actual play was made difficult owing to the expense of purchasing an army or navy's worth of miniatures. As leisure time and disposable income generally rose through the 20th century, miniatures games slowly gained a following. Most gaming groups informally wrote or revised their own rules, which were never published. A mass market emerges in 1955. Jack Scrubby started producing miniatures using RTV rubber molds, which greatly reduced their expense, and he turned this into a business in 1957 and started publishing Wargame Digest. It, and its successes, put fellow miniatures enthusiasts in touch with each other, and provided a forum for ideas and locally produced rules to be shared with the rest of the hobby. Around the same time in the UK, Donald Featherstone began writing an influential series of books on wargaming, which represented the first mainstream published contribution to wargaming since H.G. Wells. Titles included Wargames, Advanced Wargames, Solo Wargaming, Wargame Campaigns, Battles with Model Tanks, Skirmish Wargaming. Such was the popularity of such titles that other authors were able to have published wargaming titles. This output of published wargaming titles from British authors, coupled with the emergence at the same time of several manufacturers providing suitable wargame miniatures, was responsible for the huge upsurge of popularity of the hobby in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Meanwhile, the first modern mass-market wargame, based on cardboard counters and maps, was designed and published by Charles S. Roberts in 1952. After nearly breaking even on tactics, he decided to found the Avalon Hill Game Company as a publisher of intelligent games for adults, and is called the father of board wargaming. The modern commercial board wargaming industry is considered to have begun with the publication of Tactics II in 1958, and the founding of the General magazine by Avalon Hill in 1964. In 1959, Diplomacy was released commercially after being developed by Alan B. Kalhammer in 1954. Unlike war games to date, it focused primary attention on the dynamics of alliances and betrayals, and avoided the use of dice or other sources of random effects. It was played by John F. Kennedy and Henry Kissinger, and the latter has said it was his favorite game. In 1961, Avalon Hill published Robert's Gettysburg, which is considered to be the first board war game based entirely on a historical battle, D-Day and Chancellorsville. The first commercial games to use a hexagonal map board were also published that year. Avalon Hill had a very conservative publishing schedule, typically about 2 titles a year, and war games were only about half their line. During the late 1960s, a number of small magazines dedicated to the hobby appeared, along with new game companies. The most important of these were undoubtedly Strategy and Tactics, and the company founded to save it from failing Simulations Publications, Inc., under SPI, S&T started including a new game in every issue of the magazine, which along with the regular games SPI was publishing vastly increased the number of war games available. The Golden Age coupled with an aggressive advertising campaign, this caused a tremendous rise in the popularity of wargaming in the early 1970s, with a large number of new companies starting up. Two of these would last for some years: Game Designers Workshop and Tactical Studies Rules. TSR's medieval-era miniatures game, Chainmail, included a fantasy supplement that led to a new phenomenon that would become much bigger than its parent hobby, role-playing games. The 1970s can be considered the golden age of wargaming, with a large number of new companies publishing an even larger number of games throughout the decade, powered by an explosive rise in the number of people playing war games. Avalon Hill's Panzer Blitz, Panzer Leader, and Squad Leader were particularly popular during this time. With their innovative geomorphic mapboard system, wargames began to diversify in subject matter, with the first science fiction wargame appearing in 1973 in one of the longest-lasting and most successful, Starfleet Battles, published by Task Force Games, appearing in 1979. Wargames also diversified in size during the decade, with both microgames such as Steve Jackson's Ogre that had one small map, about 100 pieces, and a complexity that permitted games to be completed in about an hour, and monster games, such as War in Europe, with over a dozen large maps and thousands of pieces, requiring dozens of hours to complete. A smaller but continuing presence, the boom came to an end, and was followed by the usual bust in the early 1980s. Most markedly with the acquisition of SPI by TSR in 1982. The hobby never truly recovered from this, and is today much smaller than it was during the 1970s. Numerous factors have been implicated in the decline, including the rise of gaming alternatives, the ever-increasing complexity of wargames, and changing demographics and lifestyles. During the 1980s, much of the market for wargames was dominated by role-playing games. Then, when personal computers became available, gamers could simply sit down and play, without learning masses of rules, clearing physical space, and finding and coordinating schedules with opponents. However, in 1983 Games Workshop published Warhammer Fantasy Battle, initially as a mass combat role-playing game, which quickly moved to dominate the fantasy wargaming market. When collectible card games arrived in the 1990s, the gaming market became even more competitive. By this time, many wargame publishers were already long gone. Despite the decline, wargaming continues to survive in different forms. Advanced Squad Leader became a niche hobby in and of itself, and Axis and Allies was very popular with the mass-market audience, and Games Workshop's Warhammer Fantasy Battle spawned a long-lasting line. Popular miniatures games, including the successive editions of Warhammer and the science fantasy Warhammer 40,000 game. The genre of card-driven games emerged with the publication of We the People by R in 1994, and continues in current releases from GMT. Battlecry and Memoir 44 proved that light wargames can still be commercially successful, as long as the rules are clear and accessible, and the components are high in quality. Block wargames, such as those published by Columbia Games, remain quite popular. Companies like GMT Games and Multiman Publishing continue to survive and publish highly detailed hex and counter wargames. Miniature versions. Miniature wargaming typically involves the use of 6 to 54 mm painted metal or plastic miniatures for units, and model scenery placed on a tabletop or floor as a playing surface, although other open areas such as gardens and sandboxes are sometimes used. Games with miniatures are sometimes called tabletop games, tabletop wargames, miniature wargames, or simply wargames. Miniatures games generally measure distance for movement and range with a string or tape measure. Miniature wargamers generally prefer rule sets that can be used for any battle in a particular era or war, instead of a specific event, as is common in board wargames. Because armies and terrain can be combined in all possible ways, miniatures wargaming is generally more varied and flexible than other forms of wargaming. The preparation also tends to be more time-consuming and expensive. Miniature wargamers typically enjoy painting miniatures and constructing terrain, and this is an important part of the hobby for them, because information cannot be displayed on a miniature figure as conveniently as on a cardboard counter. Miniature wargames often lack the complexity and detail of some of the heavier board wargames. The popularity of miniatures wargaming stayed relatively stable during the boom and bust of board wargames. Today, games such as Warhammer Fantasy Battle, Dust Warfare, Flames of War, Field of Glory and the newer collectible miniatures games continue to recruit new interest into the oldest form of the wargaming hobby, board versions. In the United States, board wargames are often equated with the entire hobby of wargaming. In Europe, and especially Britain, they are a relatively minor part of the hobby. The genre is known for a number of common conventions that were developed early on, but these do not necessarily appear in all board wargames. The early history of board wargaming was dominated by Avalon Hill, even though other companies, such as SPI, left their own permanent marks on the industry. With the purchase of Avalon Hill by Hasbro, no one company is identified with the hobby as a whole. GMT and Decision Games are two of the more influential board wargame companies in existence today.